A billionaire's son, accustomed to luxury and comfort, had never once experienced what life was like for the everyday person. But when his father asked him to deliver groceries to a struggling family in the neighborhood, he never expected what he would uncover along the way. What started as a simple errand turned into a shocking revelation that would shake his family to the core. Why had his father, a man who seemed to have everything, made such a peculiar request? Was there more to this task than met the eye? This unexpected journey would change everything he thought he knew about his family and himself. Brock Weston was no stranger to privilege. At 22 years old, he had inherited a life of comfort, one where every need was met before he even knew he had it. His father, Richard Weston, was a self-made billionaire who had built an empire from the ground up. Brock had never known a life without luxury. He had the best education, the most expensive clothes, and lived in a mansion with a view that stretched across the skyline of the city. Yet, despite this wealth, Brock had always felt disconnected. He didn't know what it meant to struggle, to work for something, or to feel the pressure of worrying about bills. His friends, most of whom came from similar backgrounds, lived in a world where they could always rely on their families for help, and they often took the comforts of their lives for granted. The more Brock looked at his friends, the more he realized something was missing, but he couldn't quite put his finger on it. He felt like there had to be more to life than just the endless pursuit of wealth and status. Brock's relationship with his father, Richard, was complicated. Richard had always been a hard man, driven by his business ambitions, and rarely offered Brock the kind of emotional support that other fathers might. In fact, Brock could count on one hand the number of meaningful conversations he'd had with his father, and even then, they were often about business or the importance of maintaining the family legacy. Richard had high expectations for his son, expectations Brock was unsure how to meet. He wasn't interested in running the family business, and his reluctance only seemed to drive a wedge between them. One rainy Saturday morning, as Brock sat on the couch in the family's lavish living room, scrolling through his phone, his father appeared in the doorway, looking more serious than usual. "Brock," Richard said, his tone firm, "I need you to go down to Old Oak Street and deliver groceries to the Morgan family. It's a favor." Brock raised an eyebrow. "Deliver groceries? Why?" "Because I've asked you to," Richard replied. "They could use the help, and I don't want to hear any complaints. Just do it, and don't ask questions." Brock, who had never been asked to do something so mundane, was taken aback. This wasn't the first time his father had given him a strange task, but it was the first time something felt off about it. Who were these people? And why was his father so insistent on him personally delivering the groceries? As Brock gathered the bags and stepped into the luxury sedan his father had bought him, a strange sense of unease settled in his chest. The rain was falling heavily outside, blurring the windows of the car as he drove through the city, passing the glittering high-rises and affluent areas of the city he knew so well. He had never ventured into Old Oak Street, a neighborhood that was a stark contrast to the world he was used to. The neighborhood was older, filled with aging houses, small businesses, and a rougher feel compared to the pristine streets of his family's side of town. As Brock made his way through the unfamiliar streets, the sight of children playing in the rain and elderly people sitting on porches made him pause. It felt like another world entirely, a place he had never paid much attention to before. When he arrived at the Morgan family's home, he was struck by how different it was from his own. The small, weathered house had peeling paint, and the yard was overgrown with weeds. It didn't have the polished exterior of the Weston's estate, but there was something about it that felt warm. The sounds of laughter and conversation came from inside, and for a moment Brock hesitated. This wasn't where he was used to being, and the thought of interacting with people who didn't share his privileges made him nervous. He rang the doorbell, and when the door opened, a woman in her mid-30s greeted him with a weary smile. Her clothes were simple, and her hair was pulled back hastily as though she had been busy. Her name was Lisa Morgan, and she had 2 young children playing in the background. "Hello," Lisa said, taking the groceries from Brock's hands. "Thank you so much. You're a lifesaver. We've been struggling a bit lately." Brock nodded awkwardly. He didn't know what to say. This was his first time truly interacting with someone who wasn't a part of his social circle. He had expected to simply drop the groceries off and leave, but Lisa's warm, genuine smile made him feel a strange pull. She wasn't acting like someone who was ashamed of needing help. She was simply grateful. "Anything else I can do?" Brock asked, his voice a little more than polite. He didn't want to seem completely detached, but he also didn't want to be in a position where he had to offer anything more than the groceries. Lisa shook her head. "No, we're good, but if you ever need anything, don't hesitate to reach out." As Brock drove back home, the encounter lingered in his mind. There was a stark contrast between the warm, modest house he had just visited and the cold, empty mansion he was returning to. For the first time in his life, Brock questioned the world he had been born into. Why was he given so much while people like Lisa and her family struggled just to get by? Why was his father so secretive about helping these people? The tension between Brock and his father only deepened as he continued to reflect on the experience. What did his father know about the Morgans that he wasn't telling him? And why had he been asked to play such a small yet significant role? There was more to this situation than met the eye, and Brock was determined to find out. The unease that had settled in his chest turned into a burning curiosity. He wasn't just going to let this go. And so, the mystery began to unfold, setting Brock on a path he never imagined would change his life. Brock couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the Morgan family than he had been led to believe. He spent the following week replaying the encounter in his mind. How simple and kind Lisa had been, how little she had asked for, yet how much she seemed to need. His curiosity gnawed at him, and the nagging question, "Why did my father have me do this?" persisted like an itch he couldn't scratch. For the next few days, Brock tried to go about his life, focusing on the usual distractions: his social media, weekend parties, his personal gym sessions, and his high-end fashion shopping, but none of these comforts could quiet the unease that bubbled under the surface. Brock began to notice things, small things. When he ran errands for his father, he overheard conversations between his father and his business associates, and there were whispers, quiet exchanges, half-laughs, knowing looks. The more Brock listened, the more he realized how much of the world he had taken for granted. One evening, as Brock came home from yet another lavish dinner with his friends, he overheard a conversation between his father, Richard, and his mother, Olivia. They were sitting in the study, their voices muffled but still audible through the cracked door. He was about to walk away, but his curiosity got the better of him, and he leaned in closer. "I can't keep doing this," Richard said, his voice low and strained. "I know, but we have no choice," Olivia replied. "If you don't follow through with your end of the deal, everything we've worked for could collapse. The board members are already questioning everything. We need those charity projects to go through." Brock's heart raced, and a strange knot formed in his stomach. What deal? What charity projects? He was about to push open the door when he heard Richard's voice, thick with frustration. "I know it's hard, but we've been helping them for years. The Morgans, the people in Old Oak, they're not just charity cases. They're part of our responsibility now." Brock's blood ran cold. His mind raced, trying to process what he had just heard. The Morgans, the family he'd delivered groceries to. There was no way. He had been told it was just a favor, just a simple task to help a struggling family. But now he was hearing that his father had been involved with them for years, and they were more than just a charitable cause. What was going on? Why hadn't he been told? Before he could process further, Olivia's voice pierced the silence again. "But Richard, you know the real reason behind all of this. If we don't keep helping them, we risk everything. There's something bigger at stake." Brock stepped back, his mind swirling with confusion, betrayal, and a gnawing sense of fear. He couldn't stay out of it any longer. The more he tried to ignore the feeling, the louder the questions became. There were too many inconsistencies, too many pieces to the puzzle that didn't fit. His family's wealth, the charity, the Morgans, the connections were becoming clearer, yet more tangled, and the truth felt like something he had never been prepared to face. Determined to understand what was happening, Brock devised a plan. He would return to the Morgan family's home on his own, without his father's involvement. He needed to see for himself what was going on. What had his father kept hidden all these years? What was the real story behind the Morgans? The following Saturday, with a new sense of resolve, Brock drove to Old Oak Street again, this time without the luxury of a chauffeur. His car seemed to stand out even more in this modest neighborhood, but he was past caring. He parked a few blocks away and walked the rest of the way, a feeling of unease settling in as he approached the house. The rain had stopped, but the air was damp, carrying a chill that wrapped around him like a cloak. The Morgan house looked the same as it had the last time he'd been here, small, slightly worn, but homey. The faded curtains peeked out from the windows, and the front door was slightly ajar, as if waiting for someone to enter. This time Lisa answered the door, though her expression was different from the last time Brock had seen her. She looked slightly worn, her face more lined than before, though her smile was still warm, if a little hesitant. "Brock, what brings you here?" Lisa asked, a curious but cautious tone in her voice. I wanted to come by again. I didn't feel right just leaving last time. I think I misunderstood a few things. Can we talk?" Lisa's eyebrows furrowed in confusion, but she stepped aside, allowing him to enter. "Of course. Come in. We can talk." As Brock stepped inside, he was struck by the warmth of the house. Despite its smallness, it felt cozy. There were framed family photos on the walls, small knickknacks that told stories of a life lived with love and laughter. The smell of a home-cooked meal lingered in the air, and the sounds of children's voices echoed from the back rooms. It was a stark contrast to his own cold, modern mansion, where the decor was more about image than feeling. Sitting down at the kitchen table, Brock finally spoke the words that had been brewing in his mind. "Why did my father choose you to help? There's something I don't understand. What's going on between you and my family?" Lisa stiffened, her fingers tightening around the coffee mug in front of her. She looked away for a moment, as if weighing how much to reveal. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "It's not something I can easily explain. Your father, he's been involved with families like ours for years. He helped us when times were hard. But there's more to it. There's something about our connection that goes beyond charity." Brock leaned forward, his heart racing. "What do you mean? What kind of connection?" Lisa hesitated before answering, her voice shaking. "Your family. Richard Weston has been supporting us not just with money. There's a deeper involvement. He's part of a network, a group of wealthy individuals who have been funding certain projects in the community. And, well, your father's investments were never just about money. He made promises to keep people like us in check." Brock's world tilted. "In check? What are you saying?" "Brock, your father isn't just giving us money out of the goodness of his heart. He's part of a much larger, much darker operation. It's not just about helping people, it's about controlling them, about making sure certain things stay in place. Your family, your father, they've been playing both sides of this whole community. The words hit Brock like a punch in the stomach. He felt the blood rush from his face as the truth started to settle. The charity, the good deeds, it was all a facade, a means to control, to manipulate. What kind of world had he been living in all this time? "I didn't want you to be part of this," Lisa added, her voice trembling. "But you deserve to know. This is bigger than just your father's empire. It's about power, influence, and keeping the system intact." Brock's mind reeled. The betrayal felt like 1,000 shards of glass piercing his chest. His father, the man he had always looked up to, the man he had always tried to please, had been using families like Lisa's as pawns in a game of power, and he, Brock, had been a part of it without even realizing. With the shocking truth revealed, Brock's relationship with his father could never be the same again. He was left standing at the crossroads of his life, caught between the legacy of wealth and control that had been handed to him and the person he wanted to be, the person who believed in justice, fairness, and real change. He would have to make a decision, follow in his father's footsteps, or stand up for what was right. Little did he know, this was only the beginning of a journey that would reshape his future. Brock's heart raced as the weight of the revelations pressed down on him. The truth was undeniable now. His father, Richard Weston, was not just a businessman with a moral compass slightly askew. He had built an empire by weaving a web of control, using the poverty-stricken families like the Morgans as pawns in a game of power. But as Brock sat across from Lisa Morgan in her modest kitchen, a stark sense of betrayal began to crystallize in his mind. He had been raised to believe in the family legacy, the idea that wealth and power were synonymous with success, that the world owed them a place at the top. But now, the very foundation on which he'd been raised was cracking beneath him. Lisa's words echoed in his ears. "Your father isn't just giving us money out of the goodness of his heart. He's part of a much larger, much darker operation." Brock's mind spun as his thoughts collided. He had spent his entire life being molded to take over the family business, to walk the path his father had laid out for him. Now that same path seemed tainted, painted with lies, greed, and the manipulation of the very people his family was supposed to be helping. And the more he thought about it, the more it disgusted him. But Brock's conflict wasn't just internal. It wasn't enough to simply realize the truth. He was still a Weston, heir to a fortune that could buy anything he desired. His father's influence was vast. He had built his empire on strategic deals, alliances, and the kind of control that came with money and power. The Weston family was the lifeblood of the city, and to go against it was not just a matter of moral decision, it was a confrontation with a legacy that demanded respect, obedience, and silence. Brock stood abruptly, his chair scraping across the floor. "I need to go," he muttered, his mind racing. Lisa's confused gaze followed him, but he was already halfway to the door. He walked to his car in a daze, his thoughts overwhelmed by the weight of the choices he had to make. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as he drove toward his family's mansion. His body was still numb from the revelation, but his mind was wide awake, processing the events that were unfolding. The rain had started again, heavy drops beating against his windshield, as if echoing the storm that churned inside him. As Brock approached the gates of the Weston estate, he had made up his mind. He would confront his father. He would demand the truth, the full truth, and confront the man who had molded him into someone he no longer recognized. His foot pressed harder on the gas, and the sleek, polished mansion loomed into view, surrounded by its iron gates and towering walls. Brock felt like an outsider in his own home, but he couldn't shake the sense that this was where his journey had to end, or at least begin anew. He stormed into the mansion, his shoes echoing against the marble floors. Richard Weston was in his office, as Brock had expected, surrounded by towering stacks of paperwork and the hum of his own empire. The walls of the room were lined with awards, trophies, and framed photos, a reminder of the power that Richard had accumulated over the years. The whole space reeked of achievement, of a life lived in the pursuit of success. But none of that mattered to Brock now. "Dad," Brock's voice was sharp, cutting through the air with a level of intensity he had never used before. Richard looked up from his desk, his sharp eyes narrowing slightly. "Brock, what's going on? You look like you've seen a ghost." "I know what you've been doing," Brock spat, his chest rising and falling with the effort to contain his anger. "I know about the Morgans. I know about the network you've been running. You've been using them, manipulating them, all in the name of control and power." Richard's expression flickered, just for a moment, before his usual stern demeanor returned. He set the pen he had been writing with down on the desk and leaned back in his chair, eyes never leaving Brock's face. "So you know," he said coolly, "and what do you plan to do with this little bit of knowledge?" Brock stood taller, his fists clenched at his sides. "I don't know, but I'm done. I'm done being a part of this. I'm done with you, with your empire, with everything you've built on lies." A silence settled between them, thick and heavy. Richard didn't move, didn't flinch. He just looked at Brock, almost as if waiting for him to finish speaking. But Brock could see the flicker of something behind his eyes. Concern, maybe even fear. But it was buried beneath layers of cold resolve. "You think you can just walk away from this, don't you?" Richard finally said, his voice surprisingly soft, but with a dangerous edge. "This family, this legacy, it's not something you can just discard, Brock. You have responsibilities. You have no idea how much is riding on your decisions." Brock's heart pounded in his chest as the full weight of his father's words hit him. His mind flashed back to his childhood, to the years of being groomed for this moment. The business, the expectations, the carefully constructed world of wealth and influence that had always been a part of him. "What about the people you've been exploiting?" Brock countered, his voice trembling with a mixture of rage and disbelief. "You've used the Morgans and others like them. You've kept them in poverty while you play God with their lives. That's the legacy you've built?" Richard stood up now, towering over Brock with the full force of his power. "You think you can walk away from all of this, do you? You think you can take the moral high ground? Let me tell you something, Brock. This isn't some charity you're dealing with. This is a game that has no room for weakness. You don't get to sit on the sidelines and criticize how things are run. If you want to be part of this family, you'll play by the rules." The anger in Brock's chest flared to life, and for a moment he felt like a young child again, powerless under the weight of his father's dominance. But something was different now. Brock was no longer that naive boy. He had seen the truth. He had seen the lies his father had carefully constructed, and he wasn't going to let them define him anymore. "I don't want to play by your rules anymore," Brock said, his voice steady but filled with determination. "I'm done." The tension in the room was palpable as father and son faced each other, neither one willing to back down. But then Richard's expression shifted, his eyes darkened, and his lips curled into a slow, knowing smile. "You think you're in control, don't you, Brock?" Richard said quietly. "But you're not. You think you can just leave and change everything? You think you can expose me without consequences?" Brock's heart skipped a beat as the realization hit him. This wasn't going to end with words. This wasn't just a confrontation. Richard had been preparing for this moment, and his son had just walked right into his trap. "You're too naive to understand, Brock," Richard said, his voice cold and final. "But I'll let you figure it out. I'll let you see just how far you can go. You think I can't keep things running without you? You're wrong." Suddenly, Brock felt his world tremble beneath him. The stakes were higher than he had ever imagined. His father's empire wasn't just about wealth, it was about control. And now, with his defection, Brock had set off a chain of events he couldn't undo. As Richard stepped back, Brock was left standing in the middle of the room, the weight of his decision pressing down on him. His father's warning was clear. If he wanted to walk away from this life, he would have to face the consequences that were far beyond his comprehension. But in that moment, Brock knew one thing for certain. He could never go back to the life he once knew. The battle had just begun. Resolution. Brock's decision to confront his father had sent shockwaves through the Weston family. The immediate fallout had been intense. Richard, though furious, didn't take direct action, at least not at first. The influence of the Weston family in the business world was undeniable, but Brock's stand had created ripples that could no longer be ignored. In the months that followed, Brock found himself distanced from the world he had once embraced. His relationship with his father deteriorated, with Richard withdrawing into his own private world, preferring to keep Brock at arm's length. He had always prided himself on shaping his son into his heir, but Brock's defiance was a challenge he couldn't easily dismiss. For the first time, Brock saw his father not as an untouchable figure of power, but as a deeply flawed man, a man who had built an empire on others' suffering, a man whose sense of control had warped his sense of morality. Brock moved out of the family mansion, finding a small apartment in the city. It wasn't much by his previous standards. There were no marble floors, no grandiose views, but it was a place that felt like his own. He began to engage more deeply with the community, volunteering at local shelters and with organizations dedicated to helping those who had been exploited, just like Lisa's family. He didn't know where this path would take him, but for the first time in his life, he was free to choose his direction. As for the Morgans, Brock returned to their home several times after that pivotal conversation. Lisa, initially hesitant, had come to see that his intentions were genuine. She opened up to him, sharing more about the struggles her family had faced and the struggles they still endured. Through his newfound relationship with them, Brock came to understand just how much they had given up, how much they had sacrificed just to survive. In a way, they were the real heroes, not him, but they had been kept in the shadows, struggling without the means to help themselves. Brock realized that his role wasn't just to expose the truth about his family. It was to be a bridge, someone who could help make the system that had bound them all together unravel. Over time, Richard Weston's empire began to show signs of strain. The public didn't react well to Brock's departure, and whispers about the family's involvement with local charities, particularly the ones in Old Oak, began to spread. Richard's deals, built on maintaining control over others, became harder to hide. His wealth was still vast, but the moral cost of everything he had built started to weigh on him, in ways that even he couldn't ignore. One day, months after the fallout, Brock received a letter from his father. It wasn't a plea for reconciliation, nor was it an apology. It was simply a letter stating, "I never thought you'd choose this path. I never thought you'd throw away everything I gave you. But I suppose you had to learn on your own. Do what you must." It was clear that Richard would never change. But Brock had. He had found a new purpose in life, one that didn't rely on his family's legacy. He had seen the damage that blind ambition could do, and he was determined not to let it define his future. Brock had learned that true power wasn't about controlling others. It was about empowering them. It wasn't about wealth, status, or legacy. It was about making a real difference in people's lives. The world might still be shaped by the actions of those like his father, But Brock had discovered that the most profound impact came not from the top down, but from the ground up. And in that realization, Brock found peace. He knew his path wouldn't be easy, and he had no illusions about the challenges that lay ahead. But for the first time in his life, he felt like he was on the right side of history, using his privilege to dismantle the systems that had kept so many in the shadows. His journey wasn't over, but he had taken the first step toward redemption, toward justice, and ultimately toward a life of real meaning. The Western name would always follow him, but it was no longer the legacy that defined him. His legacy, he now understood, was yet to be written, and it would be one of change,